Hi, I'm Mike with ECS Tuning, and today we're going to show you how to install an ST Coilover kit on this BMW 335i. Also, we're going to explore other options you have when replacing suspension components on your vehicle. There's several options to consider if you're thinking about a suspension repair or upgrade. You can restore your car's factory feel with OE replacement shocks and springs, which maintain your car's stock ride height. If you want the benefits of a performance suspension, we offer lowering springs and sports shocks individually. For added convenience, a cup kit combines lowering springs with sport shocks as a matched set to eliminate any guesswork. If you're looking for further control, coilovers may be for you. They don't just lower your car, they have a few added benefits. They will improve handling and appearance, and unlike fixed height lowering springs, they'll allow you to fine-tune your ride height using the built-in adjustment collar on the strut tube or the spring perch. We chose to install the ST Coilover kit on our E92 BMW 335i. Since we're not tracking this car, we won't need the adjustable dampening feature of other kits. And since this car gets stored through winter, we're not too worried about salt corrosion. Before you begin the installation, you want to make sure you have the proper tools. Now we'll be using a lift for this job, but you can easily do this in your driveway with a jack and a set of jack stands. We ask that you observe all normal safety procedures when lifting the car, and that you work on a flat, stable surface. And please, support the vehicle with an approved set of rigid jack stands. Never trust your personal safety to a hydraulic jack alone. We'll be using common hand tools, plus a few specialty tools purpose-built for a specific task during this installation. Plan now to have these or similar tools available before starting your coilover installation. To start this installation, we're going to take all four wheels off. To gain access to the top of the rear shocks, we'll have to remove the bottom and side trunk liners. Once you've removed all the rivets, the T40 Torx bolt, and release the seat, you'll be able to pull back the trunk liner just enough to access the top of the shock through this access hole. You'll need a 16mm wrench to remove the large nut on top of the shock, and a 6mm socket to hold counter so the shock doesn't spin while you spin the nut. Now, we're going to release the shock from its bottom support by removing the 17mm nut. Then, we'll remove this bolt to drop the lower control arm, which will enable us to remove both the rear shock and the rear spring. To prevent the shock from moving while undoing the bottom nut, we're going to use a 15mm hex on the shock itself to prevent it from moving. With the lower control arm still attached, we should now be able to compress the shock just enough to slide it out completely. Once the shock is out at the top, pull it out from its bottom support. To avoid any danger when removing this control arm bolt, you want to put pressure on the control arm to relieve the tension from the spring. We're using a transmission jack because we're on a lift. If you're at home, this would be just as easy with a regular jack. Before lowering your control arm, you're going to want to loosen the nut on this inner bushing to avoid any damage to the bushing itself. This will affect your alignment, but a four-wheel alignment is required anyways after a coilover install. Once the nut's loose, slowly release tension. Now the control arm can swing down all the way, allowing you to pull your spring out. Now that the rear suspension is off the car, we can begin installation of the new springs and shocks. While the bottom has a full width coil all the way to the end, the top was designed with a flat face so it can sit flush against the top spring perch. The first step is pushing the lower rubber spring perch onto the coil. The end of the coil should butt up against the stop like this. The bottom of the rubber spring perch has a contour that matches a contour on the control arm. When inserting the spring perch, make sure these contours match, otherwise it won't line up properly. Once you've done this, raise both the spring and control arm and insert the upper adjustable spring perch. As you're raising the arm, make sure the rounded head of the upper adjustable spring perch goes into the matching hole in the chassis. Now, using a jack, raise your lower control arm and align it so that the bolt holes match the ones on the knuckle. Once you've done that, go ahead and slide your bolt through and start the nut off, but don't tighten it. To properly retighten the bolts of the control arms, we have to make sure the rear suspension is at loaded ride height. We're going to use a tall transmission style jack to put load on the rear suspension until we see the car's chassis come slightly off of this rear lift pad. That way, we can ensure that the car's weight is being supported by the rear suspension. Once we've done that, we can tighten both of these bolts to 165 Newton meters. We realize that for those of you working on jack stands, doing this with the floor jack is dangerous. For you, we recommend snugging the nuts on the swing arm bolts for now, then waiting until the car is sitting on its own wheels again before final tightening the bolts. Suspension arm bushings should not be final torqued while the suspension is fully extended, or you'll stress the bushings, causing them to fail prematurely. Now for the installation of the rear shocks. It's not uncommon, depending on the application, to have to reuse some OEM components off of your old shocks. For this specific application, we'll have to use a few components. These include a metal spacer, a rubber mount, and also a metal washer. Take your new shock, insert the metal washer, then insert the rubber mount along with the metal spacer. Once you've done that for both shocks, you're ready to install them in the car. Compress the shock and drive the lower threaded shaft through the rubber mount on the control arm. Once you've done that, install the locking nut that came with your kit, and while holding the shock, torque it to 28 foot-pounds. The next step here is positioning the top part of your shock into the body. What we've done is use a floor jack to lift the suspension so that once the shock decompresses, the mount and the shock itself will sit completely into the body. Once the shock is completely in, it's time to go to the trunk and tighten the final nut. To attach the top of the shock, ST provides this type of nylock nut. While it's useful in most applications, this BMW requires a special nylock nut that comes with an OEM bushing. Keep in mind, BMW recommends replacing these every time they're removed. Now that we've installed our rear suspension and we've buttoned up the trunk, it's time to move on to the front. How you approach the coilover install on the front of your car depends on whether your car is already stock or not. For example, our 335i has oversized rotors and calipers, so we've decided to remove them for 3 reasons. First of all, we don't want to nick or scratch the painted surface on the caliper. Second, we want to protect the hydraulic brake line. And third, removing these 2 removes a lot of weight, which we won't have to wrestle with as we work. Fortunately, taking the brakes off is easy on our BMW. We remove these 2 caliper bolts and zip tie the caliper to the chassis so it can't fall. Then, remove the brake rotor retaining screw and pop off the rotor. Now we're going to remove the OEM assembly. First, reach around and unfasten the wheel speed sensor from its support bracket. Okay. Next, undo the front part of the fender liner by removing the fasteners that hold it down. Now we're going to remove the nut from the stabilizer bar end link. Remove the bracket from the brake lines. and push the link out. Loosen the nuts on the 2 lower control arms, but don't remove them. Now we're going to unclip this leveling sensor. Remove the nut from the pinch bolt that secures the strut tube in the steering knuckle. The only thing holding the strut up now are the 3 nuts on top. So we're going to lower the car down, pop the hood, and undo those 3 nuts. Loosen and remove the 3 retaining nuts on the upper strut mount. Note the location of the alignment pin for reassembly, but do not loosen or remove the center nut yet. As you undo the last nut, the strut will begin to drop down. Have your hand ready to catch the strut and make sure it goes down gently. The next step for removing the strut out of the wheel well would be turning the whole assembly slightly opposite to the side of where you're working. Now what this is going to do is allow you the little bit of extra clearance to get the strut out of the wheel well. While pushing down, gently work the strut out of the wheel well. When you come to the fender, it might be necessary to rotate the strut mount 1 stud at a time to avoid any damage to the paint. As you can see, we've masked our fender off with painter's tape to avoid any damage. The next step is separating the strut assembly from the knuckle. To do so, we must spread the knuckle apart far enough to allow the strut tube to come out. I'm going to use the Schwab spreader tool, insert it in the rear gap of the knuckle, and turn it 90 degrees. Rotate the strut back and forth in the housing as you pull upward. It may take some penetrating oil, wiggling, or a few wraps with a hammer on the strut tube side bracket. We do not recommend driving large pry bars, chisels, or screwdrivers into the gap to spread the knuckle. Overspreading it can damage the casting, making it unsafe. Also, never apply heat to any shocks or strut tubes, as it can cause the liquid inside to expand rapidly or even explode. If you need to use any parts from your old strut, use a spring compressor to compress the spring before taking the strut assembly apart. We're going to begin installation on the front part of this coilover kit. To do that, we'll have to pre-assemble the struts before they go in the car. The first step for that is going to be spinning the spring perch almost all the way down to allow maximum clearance for the spring. Then, you can throw your spring on with the machine face down, which will allow you to put your spring pad and spring plate on and match the contour on that to the contour of your spring. Once you've done that, you're ready to put on the spacer plate. This spacer plate has a groove side which goes up. Then, before putting on your strut mount, you're going to want to make sure the dirt protection washer is on top of the bearing. Once that's there, go ahead and install your strut mount, which leaves you with one final step of putting on the nut. Keep in mind we want to avoid damage when uninstalling your OEM strut or installing your new one, so be careful not to overstress the suspension to avoid damage to components such as tie rods or control arms. Before you put in your pre-assembled strut, you want to make sure the sleeve is clean and free of debris. Once you've done that, apply a thin, light film of grease to both the strut housing and the sleeve. Then, we're going to use the Schwab spreader tool to spread apart the knuckle. Now you can go ahead and carefully slide the new strut in. Once your strut is in there and lined up, you can go ahead and release the tool. Now we're going to install the new pinch bolt along with the ABS sensor bracket and torque it to 34 foot-pounds of torque. This application requires a strut gasket, after which we can throw the strut back in the wheel well and realign it at the top. This isn't necessarily a two-person job, but it can get difficult if you do it by yourself. Once all 3 nuts are snug, the assembly will hold its own weight. Tighten the strut nut using approved assembly methods to the manufacturer's recommended torque. Once your strut nut is torqued, you can apply the strut nut cover. Now, you can reassemble the front suspension components the same way you took them apart. Make sure you follow the manufacturer's assembly procedures and tighten all the fasteners to the recommended torque specs. We're going to go ahead and load the suspension before we tighten the control arm bushings. Once we've gotten that far, it's a good idea to mark the bolt so you know exactly where 90 degrees is going to be. Now that you've got your coilovers on, it's time to adjust the ride height. We suggest that you work on a level, hard surface when doing this. You're going to want to start with your suspension high to avoid any wheel to fender contact when lowering the car for the first time. Adjust all the coilovers to the same height by loosening the set screw and turning the height adjustment collar. Use a tape measure, or just count the threads below the collars to keep them even from left to right. We recommend using the thread lubricant supplied by the coil manufacturer, or light oil if not supplied, to assist in the adjustment and prevent future thread corrosion. Lower the car onto the wheels and roll it back and forth a few feet to settle the suspension. We suggest that you have a full tank of gas. Now, estimate how much weight will be in your vehicle on a regular basis and add that weight to the car. Now, use a tape measure to determine how much you can lower the car without creating interference between tire and body. Take separate measurements at front and rear to compensate for differences in wheel opening height and shape. Consider leaving a little extra ride height dialed in for the first few weeks to allow the new suspension to settle and to compensate for normal suspension travel over bumps, body roll when cornering, and steering. Once you've got your lowering dimensions in mind, use your coilover wrench to turn the adjustment collars. Make the proper adjustments and lower the car to check your work. If needed, repeat the sequence till the car sits the way you want it, without any wheel-to-body interference. Bounce the car by hand several times to be sure. Then, turn the steering wheel and bounce it again. This is a trial and error process and may need to be repeated to get it just right. When the car looks right, measure from the bottom of each wheel to the top of each wheel opening arch. The dimensions should be the same from side to side on each axle if the car is level. Keep in mind that height adjustment from side to side on one axle can also affect the ride height of the other axle. Drive the car for a week or so to let the suspension settle. Double check bolt tightness at all mounting points. You may choose to fine-tune your ride height to optimize handling performance and vehicle balance. When you're satisfied your ride height's where you want it to be, we recommend you take your car to an alignment specialist that can fine-tune your suspension geometry for optimal handling and tire wear. I'm Mike with ECS Tuning, and I'll see you next time. Whether you're installing coilovers or planning another vehicle upgrade, remember that ECS Tuning has a full line of Schwab tools. Use them to make your next automotive project faster, safer, and more successful. We invite you to visit us and browse our large selection of Eurocar specialty tools.